Um, we've got two different types of classifier in the CRS at the moment. The classifier is really a fancy word for a bit of machine intelligence or machine model, which can tell the difference between one type of reference and another. And we've got one study type classifier, which is able to tell whether or not a citation is or is not describing a randomized controlled trial, and about 50 review group classifiers, which aim to tell whether or not a given citation is relevant or not to a given review group. A machine can't learn on its own on the whole. For this type of task, it needs to learn from data. And so the data which the machine has learnt from for the randomized controlled classifier are citations that have been screened through the Cochrane crowd. And as the Cochrane crowd has done a lot and has done them very accurately, that's a very accurate classifier because it's based on lots of data and based on lots of high quality data. The review group classifiers have been based on data from review group registers, and these vary in terms of their size. So they start from a couple of thousand items in some of the registers, going up to nearly 70,000 in others. So they vary in terms of their size of the data set that they've been built on. And also because they're not delineating something as clear as RCT, not RCT, they are a little bit fuzzier in terms of their performance, but they're not bad at all. Some of the classifiers are very accurate. And what all the classifiers do, both the study type and the review group classifiers, is to give us a probability of how likely a given citation is to be or not be the class in question. So whether a given citation does or does not belong to a review group isn't a binary decision, yes or no. It's a likelihood. So it's a score between 1 and 100, or 0 and 100. And I think that's probably it. All I need to say about classifiers, how they were built and where they came from, because I think we're going to see them in action next.
That's great. Yep. And so I just wondered if anyone has any kind of questions at this point around what James has just described about how they've been built, then please do feel free to ask. Other than that, we'll move over to take a look in the CRS web now at the sort of main ways in which you can access and interact with the classifiers.
Hi everybody, Gordon here. I'm going to take 5 or 6 minutes just to recap for some of you and introduce for others the functionality that we've got in the CRS web that allows you to access the classifiers. There's several different places where you can interact with them. Sam's going to talk you through, and Anna are going to talk you through live examples of how they've used them after I've just gone through the basic features. But I think it's useful to review what it is that we have already in the classifier and how that might be suitable for what you're trying to do. There are I'm not actually going to do any searching because I know Sam's going to look at that. So I'm just going to just race through the features. The first thing is to look at the dashboard. And on the dashboard, if you've got it set up this way, you can have a widget on the dashboard that tells you a number of records that have been flagged by the classifier as records that might be of interest to you. And that's quite a useful widget to have because that tells you, without you having to do a search, that tells you all of the records that have been assigned a classifier value of between 95 and 100% of being likely of interest to your group that you don't already have in your segment. So there are ways that you can find those records by searching, and you can change the parameters in the search. But just as a quick view of what might be of interest, that's already there on the dashboard, and you can just click that and see those records. If you wanted to take a bit more control over that and to look at different things within the classifier, you can access that via the search panel. So if we click the search panel, that'll pull the search panel out, and we click on classifier. And what you can see here is a screen that lets you decide which classifier you're going to use and what parameters you're going to put on the bounds of the values that it'll pull back. So by default, it shows the group that you're logged on as. I happen to have logged on as the dementia group, so it's showing with the dementia classifier. If you want to, you can just click on the drop down and pick a classifier for any other group, which is quite an interesting thing to do if you're interested in how these scores differ across different groups. But from here, you can also pick out the randomized control trial classifier. If we clicked on that one, you'd see that the distribution of scores changes because the distribution of scores is different within the RCT classifier than it is in the dementia group classifier. We'll just go back to the dementia classifier. If you want to do a search for these values that are within the range that you've chosen, all you do is choose a range that you're interested in. So if you're interested in records that are very likely to be of interest to the group, then you'd want to be looking up this end of the scale. If you're interested in ones that are very unlikely to be of interest to the group, and you might want to do that for all sorts of reasons, then you can drag the bars down to this end, and it gives you an approximate count here as to how many records are going to be returned if you did the count. We'll keep it up at this end, so let's say we're only really interested in 99 to 100%. To find those records, we just click search, and that'll go away and do the search and return those records over here as a line on our search history.
Gordon, can you just clarify what you're searching? Searching what?
You're searching for only for you're searching on the classifier scores. So
no. Sorry, no. I mean, what data are you searching on?
You're searching all of the CRS at this point.
Okay.
So any record that's in the CRS that may be in your segment and may not be in your segment, but it's just searching on the scores and not restricting to anything else.
Okay.
Okay, so if we just get rid of the search screen to give us a bit more real estate. When you get the records back into the CRS, you can do a whole bunch of things with them. First of all, you can look at the values in the listing screen. As it stands, there the scores are not in the default set of fields that you would see, but to bring them in, you just go to the definition for the listing screen, and the scores are down at the bottom, which they're not in this example. They're in there somewhere, and you can put those into the listing and sort on them. And oh yes, they are. They're here already. That's why I can't.
Already.
Yeah, there are. Yeah, so you've got the RCT classifier score and the group classifier score. At the moment, we don't combine those. What you probably want to do is to have a single click that would combine the records that are likely to be an RCT and likely to be of interest to your group. You can combine them in a search, but it's on the list of developments to enable that as a single click, just to make that easier for you to handle. In the record listing, we list out all of the classifier scores that have been returned for this particular record. So in this record, you click on the classifier tab. You can see that it's not in your segment because it's got an add to segment button. So if you wanted this record, you could just add it to your segment at this point. The things that we show are the things that have been returned by the classifier in order of what's likely to be of interest to you. So the first thing you see is the likelihood of the record being an RCT, and in this case it thinks it's highly unlikely that it will be an RCT. And the first bar that you see is the likelihood of it being the record being of interest to your group. And in this case, the classifier thinks that it's highly likely to be of interest to your group. What we also show is the likelihood of it being of interest to other groups. And you can see in this case, it's not particularly likely to be of interest to other groups. That's quite a useful thing to have, because if you can see that a record's been found, it might be a record that you've read in, a record's been found that either is or is not of interest to your group, but it's flagging up here as being potentially of high interest to another group, you can actually just click on the record and send that to the other group so that they don't have to do the search themselves. It would immediately appear as a record of interest to them. The other things that you can do on this screen, and it's quite useful to be able to do them, is to say actually this record's not relevant to me. So the classifier said it's 99% likely to be relevant. I think it's not, for whatever reason, and there might be all sorts of reasons for that. You can say it's not relevant to me, and that will actually just set it actually sets the score to -1. And at the moment you might see some -1s creep into the group classifier score over here. That's a bug, and that'll be showing up as not relevant in future. Doing that's quite a good thing to do, partly because it means that the records don't keep popping back. So once you've said it's not relevant, then it really is not relevant. It won't come back in any future searches. But also, in due course, when those decisions get sent back to the classifier, that helps to refine the classifier, because then the classifier has an actual decision that it can add to the mix for rebuilding.
But sorry, Gordon, is the classifier? So let's say the reason is that it's not an RCT. It is absolutely relevant to the group, but it's not an RCT, therefore it's irrelevant. So if I say it's not relevant, what impact does that have on the model for that group? Because I'm in essence saying, no, this doesn't belong to this group, but it does. It's just not an RCT.
Yeah, if it was not an RCT, you would use this second option here. So you'd say it's not an RCT.
Yeah, you only say not relevant if you mean topic-wise at the moment. But we have, I think this has come up before, and
but it
might be that we need some other options, because you sort of, I see exactly what you're saying, that in a way you're saying it's not relevant because it's not what you're looking for, because it's not an RCT.
But the vast majority, like there might be some kind of, for a handful of groups, non-RCTs are important, but actually for the vast majority of groups, the real question, okay, yes, outside of DTAs, the real question is it an RCT, and does it fit within my scope? So there's something kind of seems like unnecessary. Like there's an unnecessary separation here, when in fact the vast majority of cases people want both. They don't want one or the other.
But when you separate it out a bit like this, it means that yes, something might not be relevant to your scope of a review, but it's still an RCT, and so therefore it contributes to the pool of assessments that we know about that something's an RCT, which then might be relevant to another group.
So why doesn't not relevant to me just say not a relevant topic, or not,
not in scope?
Not in scope. Maybe that's the.
That's a good point.
I think maybe that's.
Not
I think it's
scope.
about the labeling of those buttons, because we have in our minds, when we're working out what should go into our registers, the word relevant or not relevant, or eligible and not eligible, and actually that encompasses those two things that Ruth's describing. Actually, maybe it should just be relabeled, say not in scope, and also still remain that separate thing. It's not an RCT. And then I just wanted to say, I can see Jennifer's got her hand up. So Jennifer, do feel free to ask your question.
Thank you. I have a question that is similar, I think. I haven't been wanting to use the not relevant to me button because I worry, a lot of the studies that aren't relevant, so we're in the neonatal group. So what if something is dealing with the neonatal population, but it is also looking at something that we don't deal with, for example, HIV. So we wouldn't look at HIV, so it wouldn't be relevant to us, and I wouldn't want to keep seeing those studies. But at the same time, I don't want it to learn that we aren't interested in neonatal, something that has to do with the neonatal population. So I'm never sure what to do.
That's a good question.
That is a good question.
What I would say is I don't use this a lot, because when you're getting rid of loads of records, you might want to bulk exclude and things like that. I don't necessarily go through and click all these. What I try to do is maybe where I find particular examples or recurring examples of things I don't want to see, I might sort of click on those to try and give some information. I mean, maybe, and that maybe where you just don't, on this particular example, want to make that distinction. By excluding them, you're still, if their models are ever, if we ever decide to rebuild the model on the basis of the register, those records won't be in. So would less likely to get a high score, presumably.
Yeah, it feels like the safest approach to take is to use that when it really is describing something that is completely not in scope. So I have exactly the same example in the dementia group. We don't look at dementia within populations who have HIV, but I wouldn't. So I think if I saw records that, had that as the population, but the outcome was dementia, I don't think I would want to use not relevant to me, because it does contain elements of what is relevant to me.
Okay.
So maybe I would just, perhaps it is worth thinking about. It does raise in my mind the question also around changing scope, a group's changing scope over time. And, we started the dementia group just focused on dementia, and then we've expanded into prevention and cognitive enhancement and mild cognitive impairment. And, if I'd had the classifier and that option right from the start, would I have started to go, right, no, I don't want to see mild cognitive impairment. We're not interested in that. So I think maybe there is a little bit of thinking to do around when it is safe to use, completely safe to use, not relevant to me, and when maybe you should think about perhaps not using it just for those reasons. But I'd be interested in James's thoughts on that.
Thank you.
But just in terms of that specific question, and perhaps, and also about changing scope, is that, it kind of, what it sounds like is that for records that you've just described, Anna, and that Jennifer has described, you shouldn't click on not relevant. So they're just going to keep coming around. And actually, the safest thing is to let them keep coming around, but that's really annoying. So
I think we need a "don't show me again."
Is there a way that you stop seeing them, but you aren't ruling them out in a way that makes the machine think that these things don't have anything to do with dementia or neonatal?
It's tricky, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that might help with this over time, and it's not in the system yet, but it's something that is technically feasible to do, so we'll schedule it, is the ability to create different classifiers beyond the ones that we've got here, because I know that review group scopes change over time, that there are some studies in review group registers which are only there because I don't know, a particular review group felt sorry for a review which had no home, and so they took them under their wings, and really it didn't actually belong in their domain at all. And all that kind of thing is just the way that things evolve over time. And in order to build these classifiers, we've basically just taken review group register data as eliminating the scope of a group. And because a lot of them are so big, I think probably a lot of the reviews which maybe don't quite fit the scope, or the scope's changed over time, etc. They just get absorbed in the noise, and it doesn't make any make a huge amount of difference. However, it does make a difference in terms of it'll make a difference in terms sometimes of the studies popping up which might or might not be relevant. And I think probably the thing to do there would be just over time, for if that is affecting your group's classifier, just to start just building a new one which actually delineates the area of interest and use that one instead. And it might be that actually over time people use multiple classifiers for different purposes. Maybe they've got sort of subsets of groups or subsets of reviews or areas of a domain which they want to sort of narrow down on in more detail. And you know, I think that's probably the way forward. The other thing that this makes tricky for us to know is exactly how well some of these classifiers work. When you look at a classifier shape in the search tab there, you can see what should be a sort of a fairly standard U shape. Oh, great, thanks, Gordon. If you do the RCT one, that gives you something which has got a fair amount of data in it. Yeah, great. And that type of shape of a U is the shape of a classifier working well, in that it's confident at either end of the spectrum that most of the studies, actually strangely enough here, are not RCTs, though we've got quite a number that are. And the smaller number of references in the middle of those which are a little bit more ambiguous to the classifier. If you go to a review group classifier, Gordon, doesn't matter which one unless it's a terrible one. There we go. This is actually still the same type of shape. It's a U shape, yep, in that it's very confident either end. But because there are relatively a very, very small number of records in the database which are relevant to dementia and cognitive improvement, the sort of skewed, so that we've got the vast majority are on the left-hand side where it's confident they're not relevant, and then you've got a very small little number on the far right where it's very confident that those are relevant. So that's an example of a high-performing classifier, and that's you know what most of the review group classifiers look like. But strangely enough, when I've been looking at getting some performance metrics out of this, some of what the classifier sort of thinks shouldn't be within a review group's domain are, and when you look at them, you think, well, actually, they don't really fit within the scope of the review group at all. But you know, just for historic reasons, that they've ended up in there. And I think probably over time, what we'll do is we'll start to develop some cleaner data for the classification purposes. And you know, I think we're at the start of this. So if that, for example, turns out to be something that's of a priority, then maybe we should prioritize getting the build your own classifier in there earlier and prioritize that over other things.
One thing to say, guys, is I think the method I use to a degree gets around that issue of records you've already looked at and excluded. So you talked about sort of the issue of if you don't ever mark something as not relevant to me, then you're going to keep seeing it again. If you use the ability to exclude records now, then you can sort of strip those out. Particularly, there's a fix that Gordon's going to put in place where when you add stuff to your segment, you'll have an option to either include or not include those records you've already excluded. So at the moment it would just add them back in again, but we're going to have a yes or no answer. Do you want to include the records you've manually excluded or not? So that would be a mechanism whereby you would see those records again, but that wouldn't be particularly training the model to say there's a zero. You've just at the moment decided they're not interesting, and you could at some point bring them back in again if things changed. So that might be a way of getting around the issue you described, Ruth.